marriage license and everything is recognized in other states and so on. And of course, the way this has been in the news in recent years has been over the issue of homosexual marriage. This is why numerous states have passed DOMA laws, and we have a federal DOMA law as well. There are also some other exceptions. Herb and I were talking about this, and we're not going to go into it in terms of the arcaneness of it, but it can have to do with things like child custody, where one spouse moves from one state to another, and how do the custody laws get upheld or changed or whatever. So those are just a couple of examples of things that are exceptions. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list of the kinds of things that have been found to be exceptions over the years. But you can see how the idea here was to make sure that there wasn't a huge incentive for people to, if you will, commit crimes in one state and then flee to another. And of course, one of the other examples of this that became an issue in the early 1900s was over the issue of kidnapping. And you know, there have been a lot of federal laws that have come into place that would have been normally considered police operations, but were made into federal crimes because people would in fact escape over state lines. I think some examples of this, I think, are the ATF, for example, bootlegging. All right. The other thing was, I know, was the issue of kidnapping. So, for example, I think is it 3 days that if there's a case of kidnapping, there's a 3-day or 7-day period that if the child or person who's been kidnapped is missing for that number of days, then the federal government can assume that they violated federal crime, they've gone across state lines, and people like the FBI can then be involved. But prior to the early 1900s, those laws weren't on the books. And so they did have some cases of kidnapping and other things like that. Probably the most famous example, which is an interesting one, is how many of you know that Charles Lindbergh's baby was kidnapped? Do you know how they caught him?
Money.
Yeah. Do you remember why?
Marked bills.
Well, they were marked, but not in the way you think. They paid the ransom money in something called silver or gold certificates. Okay? Because at the time the baby was kidnapped, gold certificates, which you'll never see nowadays, but were basically a dollar bill in those days said gold certificate on it. All right? And and what happened in the intervening years is the federal government switched from gold certificates to silver certificates. And so this guy started to try and spend the money. And they found him through tracking where these gold certificates were coming from, which is kind of an interesting side note relative to the issue of our money. Anyway, so those are some examples of things where full faith and credit impacted us and are even relevant today. I don't know, Herb, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say, in addition to kidnapping, probably the most notable thing, you wonder why the FBI gets involved in bank robberies. Yeah. Well, it's because they're federally chartered institutions, and because it involves money and all of that kind of stuff, that triggers. So what would ordinarily just be a garden variety property crime actually becomes a federal issue.
Okay. The next clause, or section, I should say, are the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And fundamentally what this says is that states cannot pass laws which discriminate either in favor of their own citizens or against citizens from other states. And so they didn't want states passing laws that say, well, if you buy property here but you don't live here, your property tax rate is going to be twice what it is for my local residents, or something like that, or business taxes or anything like that. So they weren't able to make those kinds of discriminatory laws, which would be unfavorable. There are exceptions. One that we're very familiar with, in fact, is being an issue right now in the Oregon legislature, is the whole issue of out-of-state tuition, right? And they found that out-of-state tuition is okay because the presumption is that part of our tax money that we pay as residents of the state goes to support the colleges and therefore people who come here from out of state can be legitimately charged for that so-called difference between what our taxes subsidize in the higher education system and what an out-of-state person would pay. And so it's kind of interesting that, you know, there's a law that's, or a proposal to pass a law in Oregon that illegal aliens can in fact get in-state tuition, which is kind of interesting. So it's kind of an interesting thought to suppose that we ought to take and give in-state or illegal aliens in-state tuition, but if somebody comes here from California, they got to pay out-of-state tuition. Okay, so you know it's kind of an interesting thought process that people go through. Let's see, anything else on privileges and immunities that we should bring up, Herb?
Well, the only thing I would say is a lot of the conversation about marriage in Oregon and on the federal level, Oregon has a privileges and immunities clause as well, and the big conversation is whether or not that should apply to things like marriage or not. In other words, are you treating people the same and so on. So what happens is that there's not a clear understanding of privileges and immunities, but somebody looks at the privileges and immunities clause and says, wait a minute, if somebody else gets something that I don't get, that must be a violation of the privileges and immunities clause.
Right.
So people are kind of freelancing just by, with this phrase in a number of contexts, and marriage is the most notable one in recent times.
I mean, this is a good example of where they take the word privileges kind of out of the context, historical context, and make it mean whatever, you know, contemporary meaning would have it mean to their own gain. Kind of like people use the general welfare clause. Okay, so good example.
And if you break that down, you know, privileges and immunities, it's easy to kind of just let it roll off the tongue, but privileges connotes some sort of a benefit being conferred. Immunities talks about protection for certain types of things, you know, based on status or whatever the case may be. So it's kind of two sides of the same coin. You can't punish somebody that, you know, for a certain thing if you don't treat everybody the same way. Correspondingly, there's a question about whether you can give privileges to certain people without extending them across the board.
Another thing that they put in there was, oh, yes, Marcia.
Well, I just had a question because it seems logically in reasoning to me, illegal aliens don't pay taxes, so then they should pay out-of-state tuition because they're not paying taxes.
Well,
So how do they say
I
that?
wouldn't even give them that. I would say, why are they here?
Well, I know that. I agree with that. But logically, you would say, well, they're not paying taxes, so they should pay out-of-state for
Yeah.
the same reason that someone from California is paying
Yeah,
out-of-state
and
because
of
they don't
course
pay
the
their own
argument
taxes.
is, well, these children were here under the control of their parents, so why are we penalizing the children? Okay, which in most cases children don't pay for their tuition for college anyway. Yes, Stephen?
If we're not going to blame the children for the faults of the parents, why are we giving the children of black slaves special immunity?
What do you mean?
It seems that blacks seem to have higher privileges because they have made it known that they were enslaved at some point.
Uh-huh.
And so why are the children getting the benefits of what the parents had?
Well, again, because the children were the victims.
Oh,
Okay.
they're not the victim in this case.
So, yeah, John?
If we don't want to punish the kids for what the parents are doing, why do we have Social Security set up to this?
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of things where we're being inconsistent, right? Inconsistency is not, or consistency has not been the forte in recent years. Another thing that they did was they included in this section the requirement for extradition without any extra, for the most part. I don't know if there's any extra paperwork that has to be done for extradition, but just in general, if you think about it, if a criminal flees the United States and goes to another country, the other country has to sign over extradition papers.